Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are digging into a debate that's been going on for 2,000 years, and it all hinges on a single Greek word, a word that could completely change how we see the role of women in the early church. So, was she a deacon, or was she a servant? That's the big question. We're about to dive into this fascinating linguistic puzzle that centers on a woman named Phebe and one single, incredibly contentious Greek word from the Bible. Okay, so the heart of this whole mystery is found right here, in Romans chapter 16. It's fascinating because if you pick up a modern Bible translation, you'll read one thing about Phebe. But if you look at the historic King James Version, she's described in a totally different way.
And here it is, side by side. On the one hand, modern Bibles call her a deacon, which really implies a formal, official role in the church. But on the other hand, the King James Version calls her a servant. And this entire debate boils down to one Greek word, Diakonos. So, was it an official title, or was it just describing her actions? Let's dig into the evidence for both sides.
All right, first up, let's build the case for deacon. To really get a handle on this, we have to see how this word diakonos is used in other parts of the New Testament. Because, in any language, a word's meaning isn't just fixed. It's all about the context.
So, at its most basic level, the word just means someone who serves another person. Simple enough. But here's where it gets interesting. Scholars who argue for the deacon translation, they point out that some really key figures, including the Apostle Paul himself, use this exact same word to describe their own ministries. So clearly, it's a term that can carry some serious leadership weight.
And you can really see this flexibility in action right here. In the Gospel of John, the diakonoi are just workers doing a job. But when Paul uses that same word for himself and Apollos, he's talking about their foundational leadership roles. So the argument goes like this. Since Paul uses the term for leaders, his use of it for Phebe, who's explicitly connected to a specific church, really points toward an official position.
So if the context can point toward deacon, you might be wondering, why did the super influential King James translators decide to go with servant? Well, their choice is based on a totally different line of reasoning, one that argues for a much more precise and narrow definition of what the office of a deacon actually is.
Now, the next piece of this puzzle actually comes from the Apostle Paul himself. See, the argument for servant suggests that we don't have to guess what he meant by the office of a deacon. Why? Because he lays out a pretty specific job description elsewhere in his letters.
The core idea here is a classic one in theology. Let the Bible define its own terms. So, to really understand what Paul meant by the office of a deacon, this view says we have to look at the one place where he spells it out in black and white.
And he does just that in his letter to Timothy. He gives this clear checklist of qualifications for anyone who's going to hold this formal office. It's all about character, integrity, and one very, very specific family status.
That last point on the list? Yeah, that's the one that's critical to this whole argument. In the original Greek, the phrase is mias gonekos andres, and it's pretty unambiguous. It translates to a one-woman man, or husband of one wife. And what's more, Paul uses this same exact gendered requirement for the office of bishop, too.
So here's the argument in a nutshell. If Paul himself defined the office of deacon as requiring the person to be the husband of one wife, then calling Phebe, a woman, a deacon would create a direct contradiction in his own writings. The translation servant, however, keeps everything consistent across Paul's instructions for how the church should be structured.
But wait, there's more. Next up is another grammatical clue for the servant case, and this one might just be the most significant of all. It really goes to show you that sometimes the smallest words can carry the biggest meaning.
It all comes down to the word the. Seriously, proponents of this view argue that if Paul meant Phebe held a specific office, he very likely would have written being the deacon. But he didn't. The actual Greek text just says being a servant without that definite article. This suggests that Paul is describing Phoebe's activity, what she does, not her formal title.
Okay, so this all leads us to a really crucial theological distinction that's right at the heart of this entire debate, the difference between the call for all believers to serve and the very specific qualified office of a deacon.
This table really brings the two viewpoints into focus. One interpretation sees diakonos as an action, the humble work performed by people like Phebe and Apollos. The other interpretation sees it as a formal office, part of an authority structure that has very specific written qualifications.
So the argument for servant isn't about diminishing Phoebe's role at all.
The claim is that it's a precise description of her vital work that Paul himself praises highly, without creating a conflict with the rules he laid out somewhere else. Of course, the other side maintains that calling her a deacon was a completely accurate and well-deserved reflection of her leadership.
At the end of the day, this deep dive into grammar and context just shows how one single translation choice can end up shaping 2,000 years of theological understanding. It is a powerful reminder of just how much history can hang on a single word.